and welcome to tonight's talk on researching revolutionary theatre director Harley Granville Barker. My name is Rebecca Simpson. I'm Head of Engagement at Senate House Library. I'm joined by Dr Richard Ashby, Visiting Research Fellow, and Dr Andrew Nash, Chair of the Friends of Senate House Library, who will be giving a brief introduction to this evening's event in just a moment. I'm sure you're all very used to online events now, but I'd just like to remind you to keep microphones on mute and videos off during the presentations. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of Richard's talk. And if you could use the Q&A function in Zoom, then we can manage those questions and Andrew will be chairing those comments. So before I hand over to Andrew, I wanted to share some brief highlights from Senate House Library. Over the last year, the library has been a beacon of hope for many trying to keep up with research and studies during the pandemic. We introduced Click and Collect, which has been massively popular, and also provided limited access on site during the lockdown when many libraries couldn't open. Now lockdown has lifted, we've increased study spaces and access, extending opening hours Monday to Friday, 10 AM to 7 PM. And that's all managed through the new online booking systems. This is all thanks to Senate House Library staff and leadership by Richard Warren and Caroline Kimball, who have seen us through these rather challenging times. So thank you all for your support if you visited the library over last year. This year, we're marking the 150th anniversary of Senate House Library's founding collections. To celebrate this milestone, there will be an online gallery of 150 unique and treasured items that chart the growth of the library in becoming one of the UK's largest academic libraries in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. That will be launched on Friday, the 8th of June, which is really exciting, and that's exactly 150 years to the day of when those first significant collections were given to the library. Also in June, we're delighted to welcome Catriona Cannon, who will be the new librarian and director of Senate House Library. She joins us from the Bodleian Library, University of Oxford, on 23rd of June. We're all very much looking forward to her joining us and establishing the vision or developing the vision for the future of Senate House Library. So that's all from me now. I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who will introduce Richard. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Becca. Yes, as Chair of Friends of Senate House Library, it gives me great pleasure to welcome everyone to this evening's event. This is the second digital event that's been co-presented by Senate House Library and the Friends, following on from last year's postponed Holden lecture, which took place in October. While we would, of course, love to be in Senate House for this event, we're delighted that the online platform allows us to welcome University of London alumni from many different countries. Now, this year we took the decision to combine the Charles Holden lecture, which is given annually, with the Senate House Library Visiting Research Fellowship lecture. And I just want to say something about the Visiting Research Fellowship scheme, which is funded in partnership with the Friends of Senate House Library and offers postdoctoral researchers a generous stipend to undertake research in the library's world-class collections. And in spite of the disruptions caused by the global pandemic, it was a great pleasure for everyone concerned that we were able to run the fellowship this year, and that we were especially pleased to be able to make the award to Dr Richard Ashby, who has undertaken research on the Harley Granville Barker collection. And we're all very eager to learn more about his work on this fascinating and under-researched collection in a few moments' time. Dr Ashby's work specialises in the cultural afterlives of Shakespeare, particularly in periods of crisis and catastrophe. His monograph, King Lear After Auschwitz, Shakespeare, Appropriation and Theatres of Catastrophe in Post-War British Drama, was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2020. It considers the way British playwrights have used the play to respond to the catastrophes of modern times, epitomised by the Holocaust. Richard is now working on two separate projects on Shakespeare in Holocaust Testimony and Shakespeare and the First World War. And he's published recent articles in Textual Practice, Contemporary Theatre Review, Adaptation, and other leading journals. His work at Senate House Library, as I have mentioned, has focused on the Granville-Barker collection. He's been looking particularly at Granville-Barker, Shakespeare, and the First World War. And it gives me great pleasure now to hand over to him to deliver the Visiting Research Fellow Lecture and the Charles Holden Lecture of 2021. Richard.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I just want to take a moment as well just to say thanks to the Friends of Senate House Library, and also to the staff and the librarians at Senate House Library who've supported this research. Obviously, it's not been the easiest time to conduct research, but I've been tremendously supported by all of the staff at Senate House, and it's been a real pleasure to work with them as I've worked on this collection. And before I do start, I'd just like to very quickly say that I'm kind of suffering still from the after effects of a cold, so please do excuse any kind of coughing and sniffling that goes on while I give my lecture. So I thought I'd begin just by giving some background on Harley Granville Barker. So Harley Granville Barker was an English actor, director, playwright, critic, and theorist, and is widely regarded as one of the most influential Shakespeare directors of the 20th century. Barker is particularly well known for his productions of Shakespeare at the Savoy Theatre, London, The Winter's Tale and Twelfth Night in 1912, and A Midsummer Night's Dream in 1914. What's so important about these productions is the way that they moved away from the use of spectacular, realistic scenery that had typified Victorian productions of Shakespeare. These productions would aim to reproduce as realistically as possible the settings of the plays. So in the case of The Tempest, that would mean creating a desert isle, or the forest of A Midsummer Night's Dream. One production of A Midsummer Night's Dream even famously had live rabbits on stage to enhance the illusion. This type of scenery often required cuts to the play script because of the time it took to move around and slowed the pace of the action. What Barker did that was so revolutionary and so radical was introduce what we might now understand as a modern approach to Shakespeare. He removed the ornate scenery of Victorian theatre in favour of a more basic open stage. This allowed for far fewer cuts to the play, a faster pace of delivery and action, and more intimacy between actor and audience. And this is not to say that Barker dispensed with scenery, or as he sometimes called it, decoration altogether, but his use of scenery was far less intrusive. You can see from his production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and this is Puck with one of the fairies, that Barker preferred an open stage with less realistic scenery. You can also see from this image that he typically used simple curtains with abstract designs to gesture towards the settings of the plays. You can also see from this image that there's not a bunny in sight. Just compare that with the ornate splendor of the 1900 Herbert Tree production of the play. So Barker would go on to influence generations of Shakespeare directors, from Peter Brook to Adrian Noble and beyond. Actually, as part of this project, I spoke to the theatre director, Stephen Unwin, who also referenced in our conversation Barker and his admiration for him. Barker remarked in a 1915 interview that what is really needed is a great white box. That is what our theatre really is. And that's a vision that would ultimately come to be realised by Brooke, most obviously in his own production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, the revolutionary avant-garde approach that Barker brought to Shakespearean production was brought to an end by the outbreak of the First World War, which Barker publicly supported despite thinking the conflict, quote, infernally stupid. Many of his ideas were derived from European and Russian theatre, especially German theatre and Max Reinhardt, and he reflected that many of his closest friends were, quote, enemy aliens. Prior to the outbreak of war, Barker had been planning on staging Macbeth, but the production was not to be. Over the period 1914 to 15, Barker toured Shakespeare and Greek drama in the neutral US as part of a soft British propaganda campaign. He would also serve in and write a short history of the Red Cross in France in 1916, before enlisting in the British military intelligence services. So Barker is famous for revolutionizing the presentation of Shakespeare on stage, but he is perhaps equally as famous for his premature retirement from directing after the First World War. After the cessation of hostilities, Barker largely turned his back on the theatre. He was still involved in some productions, perhaps most famously the 1940 Old Vic production of King Lear, He was also responsible for translating and producing some Spanish plays. But he was nowhere near as active or prominent in the theatre as he had been. His approach to Shakespeare became more academic and literary, reflected in his widely celebrated series Prefaces to Shakespeare. These short introductions provided close analyses of individual plays as works of dramatic theatre as opposed to literature. So Barker continued to insist on reading the plays as works of and for performance, but he did not necessarily enact his ideas about the plays on stage. So Barker moved to Paris in 1931, but had to flee in 1940, shortly before the fall of France. He would move to New York via Lisbon. During his time in the US, he worked for the New York-based British Information Service, the BIS as it was called, which prior to Pearl Harbor was tasked with providing propaganda against American neutrality. Barker was briefly head of the speaker section, arranging lectures and talks that promoted British culture and perspectives to US audiences. Now, Barker often lamented that he could not be more actively involved in the war, or as he put it, digging trenches in Norfolk. But he also stated his belief that he could use Shakespeare as, quote, a war asset. So once again, Barker found himself in the position of contesting American neutrality through theatre and especially through Shakespeare. Barker would return to France in the spring of 1946 before his health declined, and he died of arteriosclerosis in the August of that year. There has been much debate over precisely why Barker left, and some of his contemporaries would say betrayed the theatre and stopped staging Shakespeare after the First World War. Some of the more prominent theories include his divorce from the actress Lila McCarthy and his marriage to the American heiress Helen Huntington, who is supposed to have hated the theatre. Helen was in fact a novelist and poet in her own right and didn't really hate the theatre as much as has been claimed. Another theory is his increasing alienation from his erstwhile mentor George Bernard Shaw, who hated Helen, and the feeling was certainly mutual. His frustration with the degraded state of British theatre and culture after the conflict. His increasingly poor health. Some scholars have suggested that Barker was suffering from a consumptive illness, possibly TB, which was the disease that killed his sister. Or it may simply be his desire, as he revealed in a letter to John Gielgud, to prioritise his writing. Barker actually referred in that letter to the fact that he felt that performance in a way was quite an ephemeral thing, and that through his writing he could make a more lasting contribution to Shakespeare production. By concentrating so intently on the reasons why Barker may have turned away from the theatre after the First World War, however, criticism has tended to overlook the way that Barker used Shakespeare to reflect on his understanding of war itself, not only the First, but also the Second World War. So my project in the collection aimed to investigate the way that Barker used Shakespeare to reflect on the conflicts that shaped, or indeed unshaped his life. Please excuse me, that shaped his life. So I was less interested in my research in the collection in speculating as to why Barker may have left the theatre, and more interested in looking at the way that he might have used Shakespeare to reflect on the wars. So Senate House holds the Harley Granville Barker collection, which is made up of his personal library. Barker had to leave his library behind him after fleeing France in 1940. While he was away, its contents were inventoried by the Gestapo, who seemed to have taken an active interest in Barker. But his library would survive the war and was held in France before being acquired by Senate House. Now, probably the most important part of the collection, particularly for Shakespeareans, are the Ardens editions of Shakespeare. Barker made copious, and I do mean copious, handwritten notes directly in his Arden editions of the plays, typically in preparation for his prefaces. So here are a few images. These are from his editions of Macbeth and Othello. Hopefully they give you an idea of how densely Barker annotated these books. I've also found that he seemed to be in the process of preparing a preface, excuse me, on As You Like It, which was left unfinished. Excuse me. So this is actually a new discovery from the collection, and one that I'm going to be following up on. Now, Barker tends to avoid contemporary or topical allusions in his published writings on Shakespeare. This is particularly true of his prefaces. These were written with the aim of providing other producers with practical advice about staging the plays, not to analyse parallels between Shakespeare and the present. And some contemporaries actually criticised Barker for this approach. L.C. Knights upbraided Barker in 1934 for failing to consider the bearing of Shakespeare on modern life. Barker does, however, refer to contemporary events in his Ardens, not least the World Wars. So Senate House has a uniquely important resource in that sense, which can be used to assess the way that Barker used Shakespeare to reflect on the wars that transpired in his life. And recent years have seen a great deal of criticism emerge dedicated to the topic of Shakespeare and war. I've listed some here: Shakespeare and War from 2008, all the way up to Shakespeare and the Ethics of War in 2019. Now, Barker is amongst the foremost Shakespeareans of the 20th century, and he lived and continued working through both of the world wars. Yet he's only rarely featured in criticism that has set itself the task of bringing Shakespeare and modern war into dialogue. Indeed, there's only a single mention of him in all of the works here that I've cited. So the collection at Senate House, I think, allows us to situate or to resituate Barker in the growing critical conversation around Shakespeare and war. Now, the edition that I want to concentrate on today is the 1922 Arden edition of Coriolanus, which, as you can see, is very heavily annotated indeed. Up to 95% actually of the pages are marked. So it's very rare to find a page that Barker hasn't written at least something on. I'd also like to show you some images from the play itself, just again to give you an idea of how closely, how densely Barker is commenting on the text. I also want to pause for a moment to consider a problem that every Barker researcher has to confront, which is his handwriting. Barker learned to use a typewriter in 1942. He quipped at the time that it was the one benefit the war had brought to his friends because they no longer had to struggle with his handwriting, and I can empathise with those friends. Barker doesn't date the note that he makes in his Arden Coriolanus, but he gave a talk on the play for the Alexander Lectures, which he delivered at University College Toronto in 1942. This talk would go on to form the basis of his preface on the play, which was published in 1947. So it's not possible to date the notes that Barker makes in his Arden with complete certainty, but I think it's fair to say that he's making these notes in preparation for his lecture and then in preparation for his preface. It's certainly safe to date them after 1941, not least because, as I'm about to show, Barker refers to the strike on Pearl Harbor in his notes. So I appreciate that Coriolanus is not amongst the most well-known plays by Shakespeare and has generally failed to attract the same canonical status as Hamlet's Macbeth, Othello, and King Lear. This was certainly the case when Barker was studying the play, though notably some, T.S. Eliot and Wyndham Lewis among them, were profoundly drawn to the play. I think it's probably fair to say that the play is going through something of a renaissance today, not least because of the Fiennes film and the Hiddleston production a few years ago at the National Theatre. So to give a quick précis of its plot for those of you that might not be familiar with the play, spoiler alerts ahead. Coriolanus tells the story of the Roman general Caius Marcius, famed for his military prowess and his contempt for the common people, the plebeians of Rome. At the start of the play, the plebeians are in revolt over food shortages, and Rome also finds itself threatened by a rival nation, Volsci. To quell the popular uprising, the plebeians are granted representatives or tribunes in the Roman Senate, something that Marcius despises. No sooner has that more democratic system been instituted than news arrives that Rome has been invaded. Marcius takes a prominent role in the war and captures the Volscian town of Coriolis virtually single-handed, in recognition of which he is given the name Coriolanus. Peace between Rome and Volsci is brokered, and on his return to Rome, his patrician allies attempt to install Marcius as consul. But the tribunes goad Marcius into proclaiming his hatred of the masses and his desire to revoke popular representation in favour of a more authoritarian political system. Marcius is banished, and he allies himself with the Volscians, who are secretly planning another invasion. Marcius is talked out of his vengeful plan to raze his native city by his mother, and he makes peace with Rome. He is subsequently assassinated by the Volscian leader, Aufidius, who at the end of the play, very unceremoniously and degradingly, stands on Coriolanus' corpse. Coriolanus is often regarded as the most political play that Shakespeare wrote. Its action obviously poses questions around authoritarianism and democracy, war and peace, the interaction between the private and public spheres, and the relationship between the individual and the masses. These are questions that were obviously pertinent over the period from the outbreak of the First World War through to the end of the Second World War, and that I would suggest are also strikingly relevant now. Coriolanus is certainly a play that Barker felt had relevance to his times. He writes in his 1945 work, The Use of the Drama, that it does not take modern costume to make the politics of Coriolanus modern enough, and that the various characters in the play are, quote, in politics still. So by studying his Arden notes on Coriolanus and other of his published pieces on Shakespearean theatre, I want to show that Barker uses the play to reflect on the events of the First and the Second World Wars. I also want to consider the contradictions that emerged in his political outlook over that crucial period of world history and the ideological ambivalence of the ideas that he develops through his interpretation of the tragedy. These principally have to do with the emergency suspension of democratic institutions and the nature of wartime leadership. So I want to contend that in his interpretation of Coriolanus, and especially the role played by its titular hero, Barker weighs the necessity of a strong military leadership that revokes democratic rule in order to properly prepare for and fight war. This is especially the case when democratic society fails to confront threatening enemies. So the relationship that Barker draws between Coriolanus and the Second World War is most obvious in his response to Act 1, Scene 2. In the scene, Aufidius laments that, quote, they of Rome are entered in our councils, and through the use of spies have discovered that the Volscians intend to invade Roman soil. Aufidius worries that, quote, by the discovery, we shall be shortened in our aim, which was to take in many towns, ere almost Rome should know we were afoot. As you can see, Barker writes next to this speech, very simply, Pearl Harbor. It's a very striking analogy to make. Barker, who was in the US by the time of Pearl Harbor, draws a parallel between the Volscian plan and the surprise 1941 strike by Japan against the US, which also took place before an official declaration of war. This attack was similarly intended to catch the US and US forces unawares. It also had the strategic aim of ensuring the US would not intervene as Japan, like the Volscians, took in new territory in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So when he reflected on the events of Pearl Harbor in his own history of the war, Winston Churchill revealed that, quote, I never received a more direct shock. There were no British or American capital ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific, except the American survivors of Pearl Harbor who were hastening back to California. Even so, the night after the strike, Churchill, quote, slept the sleep of the saved and thankful, as the US would now inevitably have to respond and enter into the war. I can't help but think that Barker may also have slept a little bit more serenely after Pearl Harbor, as devastating attack as it was. It's worth remembering that on his arrival in the US, he was tasked with contesting American neutrality through the British Information Service. So as a British national living in wartime exile in the US, and someone tasked with contesting US neutrality, it's perhaps not too surprising to find that Barker refers to Pearl Harbor, that he has Pearl Harbor on his mind when he writes his notes about Coriolanus. So through his analogy, Barker casts the Romans in the role of the Americans and the Allies, while the Volscians represent Japan and the Axis. Barker is wary of oversimplistic dichotomies, and he warns in his preface to the play that, quote, Shakespeare is not painting in ultra-patriotic black and white, but nonetheless, quote again, we are on the Roman side and they are foreigners, foreigners in inverted commas. This distinction between the Romans and foreigners is also apparent in the way that Barker often aligns the Roman virtue of stoicism with English wartime endurance. It's certainly not unusual for Barker to comment on the Englishness of Shakespeare or his characters in his Ardens editions, something that I'll touch on again in the conclusion. But the tendency becomes particularly marked in Coriolanus and its depiction of war. So when in Act 1, Scene 4, Marcius and Titus lay a wager on whether Cominius, another Roman general, has engaged the Volscian army, Barker observes that the figures may, quote, be two Englishmen happily betting, as if a bet is the right thing to be doing just before engaging the enemy. He makes the same observation when Menenius remarks that necessity means recent travails, quote, must be patched with cloth of any colour. A kind of make, do and mend approach that Barker describes again in his notes as, quote, very English. So the concept of English Stoicism, and the avowed Stoicism of the English, represented an important ideological symbol of resistance to Nazi Germany in the period of 1939 to 41, prior to the entry of the US into the war after Pearl Harbor. And it's a virtue that Barker discerns in the action of Coriolanus. He will typically equate Roman Stoicism with English endurance. Now, the obvious distinction between Pearl Harbor and the action of Coriolanus is that the Romans become aware of the Volscian invasion through the intervention of spies. Barker, and this perhaps reflects his time serving in British military intelligence in both wars, is very drawn to the representation of espionage and subversion in Coriolanus, often noting the action around spies and spying in the text. He remarks that, quote, much intelligence passes between Rome and the Volsces, a point to be made more than once. He also laments that Rome, not unlike wartime France and Britain, quote, has her fifth column. This allusion to fifth columnists again aligns Coriolanus with the Second World War. The phrase, which is thought to have originated in the Spanish Civil War, became particularly common over the period of the late 1930s into the early 1940s. The fear of betrayal was only deepened by the rapid fall of France, which was sometimes blamed on internal weakness caused by a pro-German fifth column in the country, a theory that Barker was no doubt aware of. Churchill, in a June 1940 speech about enemies within, insisted that Parliament has given us the powers to put down fifth column activities with a strong hand. The phrase was also current in the US, as I've demonstrated here as well with this poster. In July 1940, Time magazine insisted talk of a fifth column was, quote, a national phenomenon. Life adopted an approach that was somewhat more sensationalist, running a series of photographs supposed to reveal signs of a Nazi fifth column everywhere. The term also has particular relevance to Pearl Harbor. The US Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, stated that, quote, the most effective fifth column work of the entire war was done in Hawaii. There was a theory at the time that part of the reason why the US was caught unawares was because there were pro-Japanese spies operating on Hawaii. So once again, the interpretation of Coriolanus that Barker provides is clearly inflected by the events and the discourse current in the Second World War. He also continues to identify Rome with the Allies and the Volscians with the Axis when he refers to subversive fifth columnists in Rome itself. By emphasizing the various allusions found in his Arden Coriolanus, I do not want to make the case that Barker reduces the action of the play to the events of the Second World War. It's worth remembering that the notes that he's making in the play are primarily for his lecture and his preface, and that the prefaces were really about offering a kind of blueprint for a way that a play might be staged. Even so, the allusions to contemporary events to be found in his Arden do indicate that Barker sees some interesting parallels between the play and the Second World War. So I'd suggest that Coriolanus is a play through which Barker could grapple with and try and understand some of the events that were going on around him. I would also suggest that Barker is using the play to reflect on the relationship between the First and the Second World Wars. And this becomes particularly apparent when he considers the peace treaties that are depicted in the play. So one phrase that Barker uses in his Arden edition is the good peace. What he means by the phrase is the ability of rival states to achieve a mutually advantageous peace after a period of war, which will prevent the need for future conflicts. Barker takes his cue from the peace treaties depicted in the play. First is that broached by Cominius. After the Romans conquered Coriolanus and put down the rest of the Volscian forces, Cominius sets about establishing the basis for a peace treaty between the warring nations. He says, "You, Titus, last muster Coriolanus back. Send us to Rome the best with whom we may articulate for their own good and ours." Probably can't quite see this note, but Barker writes here, Shakespeare is making the good peace. Cominius is clearly seeking for an equitable peace on equitable terms. He not only stipulates the best of the Volscian nation be sent to Rome to parley, so avoiding a peace conducted on socially unequal footing, but he also insists that the peace terms should be for their own good and ours. So though it's not stated explicitly in the play, Barker is by no means wrong to believe that the good peace in Coriolanus is one that prevents future war by ensuring that the defeated side is not treated too unjustly by the victors. What is to be avoided at all costs is making the sort of peace that, to quote the play, makes men hate one another. After he reneges on his plan to destroy ungrateful Rome, Coriolanus acquiesces to the demands of his mother, Volumina, whose suit is that you reconcile Rome and Volsci. And she says, while the Volscis may say, this mercy we have showed, the Romans, this we received, and each to either side give thee all hail to thee and cry, be blessed for making up this peace. What's being aimed for at here, writes Barker in his Arden, is a good peace, though Coriolanus clearly does not achieve it. The Volscians are not satisfied with the reparations stipulated in the treaty, and Aufidius will go on to assassinate Marcius. Now, Barker actually has a full copy of the Versailles Peace Treaty in his library collection. He doesn't make any notes in it, But he does make a point of saying in correspondence that he wrote towards the end of the Second World War that he had read the treaty in its entirety. The phrase "the good peace" was certainly current at the end of the Great War. The British delegate Harold Nicholson, whom Barker actually names in the notes that he makes in his Arden edition of Antony and Cleopatra, it's another story, wondered, are we making a good peace? Nicholson was concerned, as were some other British and American observers, that France wanted to enact reparations against Germany that were far too damaging. There was general worry that the more conciliatory approach advocated by US President Woodrow Wilson, which was purposed with instituting a whole new international order through the League of Nations, was being imperiled. John Maynard Keynes also used the phrase in his 1919 The Economic Consequences of the Peace, in which he lamented that the Carthaginian peace treaty was likely to lead to German resentment and renewed conflict. Keynes stated that disinterestedness and magnanimity would have given us the good peace. And Churchill also used the phrase. He reflected at the time that those who can win a war well can rarely make a good peace, and those who can make a good peace would never have won the war. So when he uses the phrase "the good peace," Barker is, I think, invoking the end of this First World War and the Treaty of Versailles. This, as was all too obvious by the time that he began to write about Coriolanus, had failed to establish anything like a lasting peace. It may also be the case that Barker is alluding to the type of peace to be treated at the end of the Second World War, and indeed that mistakes about a post-war settlement should not be repeated. Barker states in The Use of the Drama that with the end of the war in sight, the question of peace was now paramount. He says, but what of the peace? Its utility depends on the worth of the men who are to work it, upon our worth. Certainly we have high ideals, and in providing for the world's peace, the very best intentions. But these can make hell's pavement, as we know. The victors in a war are not, as a rule, very apt at self-examination. For 10 years after the last war, I lived in France, a country I love much. The French custom was to speak of November 11th, not as Armistice Day, but as the day of victory. There was nemesis in the very words. Victory this time is to lay on us an even greater responsibility than that we shouldered and let slip 25 years ago. Shall we be equal to it? There is a grim question. So with the spectre of the end of the First World War still haunting him, Barker recognizes the responsibility of producing a lasting peace after the Second. His tone is, however, not particularly sanguine, concluding as he does that whether the victorious nations are equal to it is a grim question. While he relates the action of Coriolanus to peace, however, Barker also appears concerned in his Arden Coriolanus that a desire for concord can slip precipitately into appeasement. This becomes apparent in his Arden edition in the notes he makes around the action of Act 3, Scene 1. Inquiring into the rearmament of the Volscians and the rushed peace terms that a new show of force requires, Coriolanus asks, Tullus or Phidias then had made new head. He had, my lord, and that it was which caused our swifter composition. So then the Volsci stand but at first, ready when time shall prompt them to make road upon us again. They are worn, Lord Consuls, so that we shall hardly in our ages see their banners wave again. Writing in his preface to the play, Barker describes Cominius as the Pacific Cominius. But in his Arden, he is, as you can see, somewhat blunter. With a dash pointing to his speech beginning, they are worn, Barker forcefully inscribes the word appeaser, exclamation mark. Once again, Barker is alluding to events and the events that led up to the Second World War. This time, however, it is the policy of appeasement as pursued by the British government over 1937 to 1939. Barker implicitly cast the Volscians in the role of the rearmed Germans, ready to make road into Europe again, while the Romans, or perhaps more rightly, Lartius and Cominius, are cast as appeasers, attempting to bring peace by swiftly composing the terms of peace and consenting to new demands. So far from a mutually beneficial peace and a lasting peace, the peace treaty between the Romans and the Volscians begins, as Barker sees it, to resemble the infamous Munich Agreement of 1938. It is a hastily patched up treaty designed to prevent or merely to postpone aggression from the newly armed Volscian nation. Barker is conscious then that failed or inequitable peace treaties can lead to more war, insisting on the necessity of reaching a good peace that does not impose too strict conditions on the defeated. But from the perspective of the Second World War, he also seems suspicious of simply appeasing enemies that intend to return to all-out war when the time shall prompt them. Cominius appears to believe that the Volscians have been so worn by the war, but also by the conditions of the peace settlement, that they will not be able to make future war, which soon turns out to be wrong. The spy Adrian confirms in Act 4 that the Volscians are, quote, in a most warlike preparation. So if for Barker, Cominius appears in the guise of a Neville Chamberlain-like figure, appeasing rearmed enemies and declaring peace for our time, Coriolanus begins to appear as almost Churchillian in his anticipation of a coming conflict. This far-sightedness leads Barker to defend Coriolanus in his Arden and in his preface. It will also lead him to support Coriolanus in his bid to suspend democracy and to institute an authoritarian military regime. So Barker writes in his Arden notes that Coriolanus is the least sympathetic tragic hero that Shakespeare portrayed. He also makes the case that Shakespeare seems to have little natural feeling for the warrior figure or the man of action, preferring the kind of introspective poet type, say Hamlet or a Brutus. But while Martius may not be an entirely poetic or sympathetic character, he does possess qualities that for Barker qualify him as perhaps the most obvious leader of Rome at a time of conflict. These should be weighed by the audience against the less obviously endearing aspects of his personality, and he is, to put it bluntly, a swine. Developing his thoughts in his published preface to the play, Barker makes a defense of Coriolanus, and he says, "Wrong-headed, intolerant, and intolerable in his dealings with the citizens he may be, but upon the actual issues between them is he so wrong. He foresaw the first Volscian attack when the senators, our best elders, did not, and the hungry populace could think of nothing but their hunger. Victory won and a good peace granted the enemy, a little to his impatience, himself made consul, he foresees another attack." Barker is alive to the irony that it's Coriolanus who leads the very attack he warns against in revenge for his banishment from Rome. But the important point for Barker is that Coriolanus, however unlikely he is to stimulate sympathy in the audience, is right about the actual issues of the war with the Volscians. He is prescient when others are not. So when the quarrel between Coriolanus and the citizens is interrupted by the best elders of Rome in the opening scene, one senator tells Martius, "'Tis true you have lately told us, the Volsces are in arms." So it would seem that Martius has been warning of the Volscian threat and has not been heeded. Barker writes in his Arden that he supports the reasonable claims of the citizens for both food and for democratic representation. But he also clearly believes that Coriolanus is far-sighted in his prediction of a coming war, and even possibly right to want to suspend democracy in a moment of crisis, where the yea and no of general ignorance may omit real necessities so that nothing is done to purpose. Barker writes in his Arden that when he learns that the Volscians have rearmed, the news makes Coriolanus immediately more dictatorial, indicating that his authoritarian tendencies are for Barker related not only to his anti-plebeian bias, but also to his knowledge of a coming conflict. The same dynamic is apparent for Barker in Act 1, when Marcius initially confronts the rioting citizens. Barker writes that Marcius is so offhand with the citizens because he knows of approaching war and, quote, so is only military in his appeal to them. With his knowledge that war is imminent, Marcius has, quite simply, no time for empty stomachs. This conflict reaches a crescendo in Act 3, Scene 1, where Marcius implies that as consul, he would use his power to at once pluck out the multitudinous tongue of representative democracy and restore to the state that integrity that should become it. So Coriolanus may seek absolute tyrannical power for himself. But for Barker, that desire is born partly of his belief that war will return and that an autocratic military as opposed to democratic leadership is required to see off the Volscian threat. He writes that Marcius is for Rome, quote, just such a leader as she may most need, with war, as is hinted, likely to threaten her again. Marcius would, of course, agree. After he is banished from Rome by the tribunes and by the commons, Marcius mockingly tells the citizens that they are welcome to, quote, have the power still to banish your defenders, till at length your ignorance, which finds not till it fills, making but reservation of yourselves, still your own foes deliver you as most abated captives to some nation that won you without blows. So Marcius once again ties his critique of democratic power to the imminent danger of invasion by some nation, by a rival nation. His animus against democracy is driven partially then by the threat of an impending war. The dangers of the wrong type of leadership emerge over the action of Coriolanus. In a footnote that he kind of buries in his preface, Barker worries that by banishing Marcius, the tribunes have formed a pacifist government. He writes, it is implied in more than one passage that the tribunes now rule Rome, and Aufidius has just remarked of them that they are, quote, no soldiers. Theirs is, in fact, what would be called today a pacifist government, quite unprepared for war. What's so problematic about the pacifist leadership instituted by the tribunes is that, unlike Coriolanus, it is unprepared for war and seems to believe that its democratic peace is going to last forever. There's an obvious dramatic irony at work in the play. When the tribunes celebrate newfound peaceful times, the audience is already aware that Marcius is marching on Rome with the Volscians. It cannot be, insists Brutus, one of the tribunes, on hearing of the invasion. The Volscis dare break with us? And this need for a strong military as opposed to a democratic authority in a period of war is an idea that Barker returns to when he considers the speech that Marcius gives in Act 3, Scene 1. Coriolanus famously states here, when two authorities are up, neither supreme, how soon confusion may enter twixt the gap and take the one by the other. And Barker writes, not in the picture that I've given, but on this page, this is a keynote of Shakespeare's thought in the play. So Barker does not necessarily mean that Shakespeare is generally supportive of single authoritarian rulers. The point for Barker is that in Coriolanus, internal division would seem to disable the state and undermine its ability to prepare for fight war. This is reinforced by another allusion that Barker makes in his Arden notes here. Next to the speech, Barker writes C.F. Fortescue's History of the Bee Army, by which he means a history of the British Army by historian Sir John William Fortescue. This monumental work was produced over the period of 1899 to 1930, covering the history of the British Army from its very earliest beginnings to 1870. Now, History of the British Army is composed of no less than 13 rather chunky volumes. And I would be lying if I said that I read every single page of these cover to cover. Fortescue does on occasion refer to Shakespeare for evidence of military life and conduct in the early modern period. My conviction, however, is that while he does not provide a specific reference here, Barker is alluding to the epilogue of the final volume, which is volume 13. This volume was finished in 1929 and published in 1930. What's notable about the epilogue is that it refers to Coriolanus-like civil strife, which is the general strike of 1926. Fortescue critiques the food shortages which the strike created, calling it a kind of civil war, though many who abetted it were loudest in denunciation of the abstract. He also denounces new demands for peace and talk of a universal brotherhood, which he utterly dismisses. These have caused, he says, only unpreparedness for war after the calamity of the Great War. So I'd make the case that the anxieties that clearly on display in this epilogue have some startling resonances with the action of Coriolanus, particularly as it's read by Barker. The obvious distinction is that the food scarcity of Coriolanus is the cause of popular upheaval as opposed to being a result of it. Fortescue worries that civil unrest and popular appeals for democratic representation and universal peace may hinder war preparedness. He states that, quote, there is a pathetic effort to make an end of war by first making an end of armaments, and that if unreadiness for hostility can be any furtherance of the cause of peace, then assuredly the English cannot be blamed for leaving the experiment untried. But, he says, the result has not been encouraging. So under conditions where split authorities undermine the ability of the nation to prepare for and fight war, the apparent necessity of suspending or quelling popular democratic movements becomes more urgent, instituting a single abiding authority that promotes the martial and patriotic ideals of, as Fortescue calls it, obedience, service, sacrifice. Not unlike Barker, Fortescue is concerned about the ability of a divided state to prepare for and conduct war. Fortescue even begins to sound like Coriolanus in his denunciation of the commons, whom he thinks, like nor peace nor war, the one affrights you, the other makes you proud. In this epilogue, Fortescue denounces the people as shirkers, the word that he uses, who have abandoned the duty to make adequate preparation for war. Just to give an idea of Fortescue, here is the man himself, and here are some of the volumes of his history of the British Army. I've actually taken this image from eBay, and these volumes are available for the knockdown price of £500 if anyone's interested. So I think that Barker would probably have balked at the patronising, kind of lordly, Coriolanus-like tone that Fortescue adopts in his epilogue. But his allusion to Fortescue indicates his support for kind of emergency authoritarian intervention to ensure that the state is ready for war. That means suspending democracy, as we've seen, or suppressing democratic and pacifist movements. So hopefully my voice will hold out long enough now just to draw to a kind of conclusion. So prior to the First World War, Barker was a prominent Fabian. He remained a democratic socialist and was generally sympathetic to progressive causes throughout his life. He was, for instance, quite actively involved in the suffragette movement. He also makes the case that by virtue of the remarkable characters that he created, Shakespeare represents the rise of the individual and the beginnings of democracy in early modern history, over and against arbitrary forms of power and authority. This development of democracy and individual rights is something that Barker understands as synonymous with English culture, of which Shakespeare is the embodiment. So Barker tends to think about Shakespeare as a kind of embodiment of an English culture of democracy and freedom. But the notes that he makes in his Arden edition of Coriolanus around the First and Second World Wars indicate that he feels in times of conflict or emergency, democratic institutions may need to be suspended in favour of strong, even authoritarian military leadership. One of the ironies of particularly the Second World War is that in order to fight tyrannical regimes, the democratic powers had to introduce states of emergency and suspend democratic institutions and individual legal rights, precisely as the totalitarian states had done. So I'd suggest that the collection allows us to situate Barker in the critical conversation that is going on around Shakespeare and war. I'd also suggest that it allows us to consider the contradictions and the ambivalences that emerged in his social and political outlook and in his interpretation of Shakespeare over a profoundly tumultuous period of modern history. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Richard, for a wonderful talk that revealed the richness of the documents in the collection, as well as offering a fascinating insight into Barker as a reader and thinker of Shakespeare. We're going to be using the Q&A function. We have about 10 minutes or so available to us for those who can stay beyond 7 o'clock. The Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen in the middle of the row of icons that you will find if you hover under the bottom of your screen. Please do, if you have any questions you would like to put to Richard, please do post a question in the Q&A and I will be able to sift through them, and hopefully there will be some interesting ones that I can put to Richard. But whilst I'm waiting for people to type, perhaps I might ask a question myself, which is I'm struck really by the ease with which Barker, reading and writing within a particular political moment, can draw parallels between the play and the contemporary political and war situation. And it makes me wonder about the critical heritage and the performance history of the play, because in a play that is so very political, that lends itself, it would seem, to interpretations of this kind, are the links that Barker is making here unusual? Is he an innovative reader of the play here, or have there been other interpretations, whether performance interpretations or critical interpretations, that have made similar parallels and observations?
Thanks so much. Yeah, and I think in terms of critical and creative responses to the play, I'd probably highlight T.S. Eliot and his Coriolanus sequence of poems. An unfinished sequence of, he wrote about four of the poems for this sequence. I think there is, in one of those, Eliot actually enumerates the German armaments that were prohibited in the Treaty of Versailles. So certainly I think for him, and then I also mentioned Wyndham Lewis, and for G. Wilson Knight as well, there was definitely interest in the play in the interwar era, and some of its ideological questions around authoritarianism, around democracy, around the heroic individual, the masses, obviously speak to that period of interwar history, of particularly European history, and also I think the rise of fascism. So I think they're certainly kind of in the mix, and I'm confident, I know for a fact that Barker would have been reading those. I mean, he has Wyndham Lewis's book in his collection, so he's aware of this critical conversation. In terms of the performance history, John Ripley in his book, which is a history of Coriolanus on stage, shows that actually performances even in the interwar era, even right up to the outbreak of the Second World War, he uses the phrase miraculously somehow, didn't really make that much reference to what was going on in the continent, what was happening in Europe, even the Spanish Civil War. So the performance side of the play, for Ripley at least, wasn't making much allusion to contemporary events. So I would say that in terms of, I think Barker is working in a critical conversation. He's very aware of other critics in Shakespeare studies. He writes them all the time. There are letters in the collection. So I think in that sense, he is operating an existing kind of discourse around the play. In terms of the performance, though, there really isn't until after the war that many performances that draw particularly direct parallels between the play and the war. So I think what he's kind of doing, and this is where he kind of occupies a really important place in Shakespeare studies, is that bridge between criticism and performance. And this is where those prefaces really sit, I think, a lot of the time, is that he's kind of trying to kind of demonstrate very often the importance of performance. He's trying to demonstrate that to the critics, who often aren't that particularly interested in performance at this point in time. At the same time, he's trying to show critics that to show that performers, that criticism can also work for the stage. So he's kind of in this kind of betwixt and between state in lots of times in Shakespeare studies.
Thanks very much. A flurry of questions have come through, so apologies if I'm not going to be able to get to everyone's, but I'm going to begin with a question from Bridget Escombe from the Department of Drama at Queen Mary. Bridget asks, would she be interested to hear anything about Barker's annotations on scenes where Marcius is particularly hopeless, her words, at running the piece? His awkward encounter with the voting citizens in the marketplace, for example.
Yes, I need to cast my mind back a little bit. They're so densely annotated, these texts. I think he's aware that Marcius is an ineffective politician. And he certainly writes in that vein. I think what he does try to convey in his notes, and what he's trying to grapple with a lot of the time, is the sense that Marcius hates the Commons, yes, and he's a tyrannical kind of guy, yes, but that there is some kind of effort to demonstrate to the people and to demonstrate in the Senate that war is imminent. And I think to a certain extent, Coriolanus views the state as a kind of war machine. He thinks that's all it is. You know, the state exists for war, that's it. And the people exist as fodder, effectively. But at the same time, and I think this is where the kind of discourse and the events around the Second World War come in so much, is that he is quite sympathetic, as I recall, thinking back to the notes, around Marcius' attempt to demonstrate that war is coming to the people and to the Senate as well. So I think in those scenes he remains relatively sympathetic to Coriolanus, whilst being very much aware that he's an awful politician and frankly, as I said in the lecture, really quite a swine.
Thank you. Sonia Massey of King's College has asked a question. Both Sonia and Bridget really enjoyed the talk, by the way. I should say that. I should relay those positive words. But Sonia wonders whether other war plays were similarly annotated by Barker to suggest that his peacetime political outlook as a democratic socialist changed at times of war. That's probably quite a challenging question, because the sheer density of this marginalia suggests that even in these period of time you've had as the visiting research fellow, you probably haven't been able to just sort of touch more than the tip of the iceberg. But perhaps you can address that question.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of key text here is the Othello, because the preface for that again is one that Barker was working on during the Second World War. I was surprised at how little there's much less reference than there is in Coriolanus to the Second World War in his edition of Othello. He does reference to the need for wartime discipline in that text, and he thinks that Othello is actually a good wartime leader, and I guess in that respect, to a certain extent, he's a little bit different than Coriolanus, because he's a little bit more savvy politically, perhaps, than Coriolanus. And he refers to Othello's response to the drunkenness of Cassio, and says, wartime discipline, where this is a state of war and wartime discipline needs to be maintained, and that's why Othello is as harsh as he is in his conduct of the way that he runs his troops and in the play. I think the thing I find his notes on Othello really frustrating, actually, because he gets completely caught up in the double time scheme of the play. So he's constantly referring to when things happen, and he says many times that the time scheme's not important, and then he goes and spends 10 pages writing about how unimportant the time scheme in the play is. So he kind of gets sidetracked, I think, and doesn't make as many allusions to events as he might do. And you really think that Othello might have provoked him to think about Nazism in terms of the fact that the play is about race hate. But he doesn't really do it. And I think the other thing that's different about the play is that he thinks of it in terms of being a domestic drama. So he's quite interested, and he refers quite a lot to Freudian psychology in his analysis of that play, actually, but he doesn't locate it in a larger kind of public sphere. So he does make references to wartime conditions and obviously to the war that was happening in his Othello notes, but Coriolanus is really the play that emerges here, and it's obviously a play that for him speaks more specifically to what's going on than perhaps Othello does.
Thank you very much. A slightly different question, which perhaps relates more to the archive itself, and also to Barker himself, which is a question about his approach to acting styles, and whether Barker associated naturalism of performance with democracy and a more virtuoso style with authoritarianism. This is a question from Matthew Fay from the Institute of English Studies, who wonders about Barker's ideas about acting Shakespeare, and whether there's a connection to be made there about his ideas on acting and his ideas on democracy and authoritarianism.
I mean, yes, is the short answer. Absolutely. I mean, Barker often kind of made reference to drama being a democratic collaborative exercise, and that acting was a collaborative democratic exercise. Part of his frustration, I think, with Victorian theatre was the kind of actor-manager system. So you'd have obviously a kind of figure like Tree who would perform the kind of signature roles against these kind of hyper-realist backdrops, and everything else was cut. The minor characters were cut, lines were cut, and you had this emphasis on the individual star performer, the star name. So Barker was much more interested in a kind of collaborative, democratic ensemble approach to the playing of Shakespeare, which he understood as being more democratic and more in alignment with what he considered to be Shakespeare's kind of original intentions for the play. As I say, he sees Shakespeare as being a democratic playwright, not a didactic political playwright, but someone whose plays kind of represent the beginnings, the emergence of a modern democracy. So I think in that respect, he certainly sees parallels between the style of playing and politics. And I think one of the more interesting prefaces is actually his preface on Hamlet. He has Hamlet at the pinnacle of the canon, but he thinks the play is actually structurally unbalanced. There's too much emphasis on Hamlet, he thinks, in Hamlet, and there's not enough of the other characters. So again, it kind of reflects this idea of a more democratic conception of playing and even the structure of a play. He doesn't really make reference too much in his notes in the Arden Coriolanus about the way that Coriolanus should be played as a character, but I think he certainly has an idea that this is someone that should obviously be dominating the scene and dominating the interactions between him and the populace. I think, as I say, that he doesn't make too much reference to how Coriolanus should be played in his Arden, but I certainly think that he would see him as being a kind of authoritarian, that he's someone that should really chew the stage, basically, and someone that should dominate the performance.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got a minute or two left, so I wonder if I might take the discussion away from Shakespeare and ask a more general question about about Barker's marginalia. You mentioned that in the case of this volume, the marginalia was probably undertaken when Barker was preparing his lecture and his preface on Coriolanus. You might not be able to answer this question, but is there evidence here or in any of the other editions which suggests that he was making marginal notes over a longer period of time? I'm thinking about different ink colours, for example, or different marking conventions. Is there any way in which you can see that this is an engagement with Shakespeare's plays that is ongoing over a long period of time, or are the editions commonly suggesting marginalia that's taking place at an isolated and concentrated moment?
Yes, I mean, my impression, just from, as you say, just from the nature of his writing in the Coriolanus, is that text, excuse me, is quite a concentrated, I think, engagement. But there are other texts, and Macbeth is a case in point where there's notes in pencil, there's notes in another in grey pencil, there's notes in blue pencil, and then there's notes in pen. And I think that's happening over a very long period. And he actually makes a reference in a letter to a revised edition. I think it's 1927 where the preface, I'd have to double check, but I think it's 1927 where the preface to Macbeth is published. He makes reference in in a letter that he actually wrote during the war that he was revising the preface, and that's been lost, that revision. But certainly we could have a look, I think, again, and something that I'm going to be working on next, I think, is looking at those notes that he makes in that Macbeth, because that is happening, I think, over a very long period indeed. It partly reflects the kind of textual history of the prefaces themselves, that he was a co-editor of these really gorgeous volumes called The Players Shakespeare, and those introductions, the introductions that he wrote for those would then become prefaces, and he would go back and revise, and he was a big reviser. He was revising all the time. So yes, I think there's certainly some of the texts, and Macbeth is the standout, I think, for that are happening over probably a 20-30 year period, where he's kind of going back and returning, and he does rub things out as well if he disagrees with himself, his past self, when he comes back to them. So yes, certainly a quite a lengthy engagement that's going on with some of the texts, not with Coriolanus, I don't think.
Right. Which could be interesting in itself. It could say something about his engagement with this play in particular. That's fascinating. I notice, I've been looking at the Q&A myself, but I noticed there's been some activity in the chat. My colleagues have been putting in a link to the Friends of Senate House Library homepage. So, and also some information about the recording of the talk that is going to be made available on Senate House Library's YouTube channel within the next 24 hours. So that seems pretty good turnaround time on the part of colleagues in Senate House Library. I think then to draw proceedings to a close, thank you again, Richard, for a wonderful talk that touched on so many fascinating things about Shakespeare, about Granville-Barker, about the special material in this collection. Thank you to everybody who put a question. Sorry if I didn't manage to ask everybody's question. Thank you to everybody for attending this evening's event. It's at this point always in Friends of Senate House Library events where I encourage attendees who are not already signed up to the Friends to join the organization for free. Even those further afield may wish to sign up to ensure that they're notified of future events. We will be holding some of these events digitally, although we do hope that in the not too distant future, we will be able to hold a big event like this, a big lecture like this, back in Senate House. So do please sign up to be a friend via the library's website. Becca has kindly put the link in the chat. So at this point, I will say thanks again to Richard, thanks again to coming, and we hope to see you at another Friends of Senate House Library event in the near future. So thank you, everybody, and have a nice evening, or a nice day if you're in a different time zone.